Laura, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ambassador. Good afternoon, everybody. President Allen of Brookings Institution and President Masolo of ISPI, distinguished authors and panelists, dear guests. I'm very glad to join you today for the presentation of the Brookings and ISPI report edited by Fabio Ruge on artificial intelligence in the age of cyber disorder. Just like all of us, I presume I would have much preferred to be sitting with you in a conference room as we did last year with another presentation. At the same time, we should be grateful to Cyberspace that is enabling us to have this presentation anyway, and I wish to thank the organizers for that. Also, because of the pandemic, cyber and digital issues have gained considerable momentum in the international debate. World chancelleries are increasingly developing and resorting to cyber diplomacy to meet the crucial demands that come from the international arena in all related fields, be it security and defense, protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms, economic growth and sustainable development, you name it. To accompany these developments, contribute to the international cooperation, and to best serve our national interests, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs has recently created a cyber department within the Directorate General of Political Affairs and Security that I have the privilege to lead. It is therefore with particular personal pleasure that I represent today the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation of Italy, which has supported the report we are presenting today. Since its onset, we quickly dive in the report into the chaotic, contested, confrontational, and honestly quite risky cyberspace that is developing around us. Artificial intelligence immediately appears as the defining emerging technology of our age. One would expect that the authors will focus on how it will influence cyberspace and international relations, international stability and security, and national defenses. And that would already be sufficient to make the study a much relevant tool for the ministry's work. However, and in a perfect example of how to think outside the box, not only do the authors come out of the box to acquire the necessary perspective, they also turn the box upside down, which we found a value added of the entire work. And indeed, the report shows that, of course, artificial intelligence is having and will continue to have tremendous impact on the chaotic, reckless, and unregulated cyberspace. It shows us that the race for artificial intelligence has become the new race for tech superiority and strategic edge. However, and in a very positive twist of perspectives, I like to underline it again, it is also able to prove that the race and the present features of cyber international relations will determine future developments of artificial intelligence itself. And that's precisely the kind of perspective and reasoning that a public institution like ours needs to be able to identify trends and challenges that might affect or boost its national interests, especially when dealing with particularly complex, ramified, and still pretty much unregulated environments such as cyberspace. I therefore wish to congratulate Fabio Ruge and all the authors of the report for a very original, insightful, and encompassing volume that will be a precious reference tool for relevant institutions and experts. And without further ado, I'd like to thank once again all of you, the publishers and the authors, and give you the floor and wish you a very fruitful discussion today.
Thank you very much. President Allen, you have the floor on the agenda.
Well, first, Ambassador Masolo, my old friend. Now, I now use the term good friend instead of old friend, because you are a dear friend and a brother. I want to thank you for the opportunity to speak this morning to so many dear friends at ISPI who are here in the conference. But let me also say before I begin that I want you to know that the Italian people and Italy are in our thoughts and prayers this morning as we all continue to go through this crisis of the COVID-19 pandemic. But it is a pleasure to be virtually with you. And as Laura said, we would sure love to be with you in person, but we are where we are today in this crisis, and we'll do the best we can virtually. To Laura, thank you for your very perceptive and your excellent opening remarks. They really set the stage well for, I think, the rest of the conversation this morning. So to get started, ladies and gentlemen, good day, good afternoon, good morning. I'm John Allen, and I'm the president of the Brookings Institution, and I'm coming to you this morning from Virginia at a place called Mount Vernon, which is just south of Washington, D.C. It really is a pleasure to be with you all. Now, I know that Ambassador Masolo will have his own views on the critical nature of today's topic and the transformational nature, both for good and ill, of artificial intelligence within the cyber and national security domains, and how that will affect geopolitics in the 21st century. But let me offer some thoughts as well. Truly, and unlike any other development in modern history, AI and other emerging technologies are poised to completely reshape the character of warfare and conflict, and indeed the character of society as we know it. For those who studied the great military theorist Karl von Clausewitz, conversations on the unchanging nature of war and the ever-changing character of war are nothing new. Within this context, it is my belief that AI will lead to a new era of conflict in which speed of decision-making and speed of action will be significantly faster than anything we've seen before. Now, for my part, I've studied and written extensively about the effects of AI, artificial intelligence, on the evolving character of war toward a concept known as hyperwar. And it goes far beyond the extensive networking of platforms in any one battle space. In fact, it goes far beyond the world of states, of militaries, and armed conflict too, but I'll get to that shortly. In this new reality, the role of humans will be very different, leading to more accurate, more comprehensive, and importantly, much faster assessments and response times. For those tuning in today who have actually served in war and conflict, you'll be able to personally attest to the potential impacts of these impending revolutions. The ability to swiftly perceive your environment to almost a near perfect degree in the traditions of conflict, and then to act with the same level of precision and enhanced speed really changes everything. This emerging environment also results in less direct control by human combatants and raises profound questions about the potential evolution of the nature of war, not just the character of war. Often the discussion of AI and national security quickly moves to the topic of killer robots, as we call them, or something similar to that, or at the very least, the impending use of artificial intelligence in lethal autonomous weapons systems. Those discussions are relevant and they're important, but as the report being launched today attests so well, the surveillance, disinformation, and human behavioral spaces are just as critical to understand. And indeed, this is doubly true amidst the COVID-19 pandemic and that environment that has been inflicted upon us. Furthermore, and to this exact point, the concern over AI's theoretical military applications must not distract us from how far-reaching the impact of adjacent technologies like big data analytics and quantum computing will be in nearly all domains of armed conflict in the future, and more importantly, all domains of the human civilization. For alongside drone swarms and advanced cyber technologies will be disinformation campaigns and surveillance networks with capabilities beyond imagining. And it will also result in predictive modeling and efficiency improvements for climate science and economy, and the economy and education and sciences and medicine and other issues, just as much as security. And all of these will be revolutionized in a way and operate in a global community that we cannot now imagine, but we must begin to think about. Akin to the mythical philosopher's stone, we will begin to enter an age where national power and national assets can be created seemingly out of thin air, with data, computing power, and advanced algorithms being the key driver, not oil, not food or water production, or even the possession of territory, something valuable out of nothing, as frightening as it is wondrous. This future I've described has undoubtedly profound implications for great power competition and for the community of liberal democracies. A prime example is the major ethical, legal, and societal implications, or what we call ELSI, with which the global community of democracies will need to grapple if society is to fully embrace this technological change and remain competitive in the race for technological superiority. Indeed, for liberal democracies, nations governed by a commitment to human rights, the rule of law within the global rules-based system, and equal representation, this will be an enormous challenge. For nations unconstrained by these shared principles, the challenge is altogether more straightforward. For today, in 2020, it is in no uncertain terms a constraint to adhere to the rule of law and to human rights. We do this voluntarily because of who we are. Yet it is a constraint that we must gladly bear in the face of foes and enemies who would trample on the rule of law, violate our human rights, and the sanctity of our constitutional democracies, using any tactical or strategic advantage, including technology, no matter how awful the cost. Champions of these sacred and shared values are under constant pressure, and indeed the numbers of these champions actually grows smaller by the day. And here, the true nature of this topic and of this volume is laid bare. The race for technological superiority may indeed be defining the competition and defining the challenge of the 21st century. And I hope we all understand that the technologies in question are neutral. These technologies are neutral. That is, they don't in and of themselves confer any particular advantage to one side or the other. But in their application, they will reflect, they will magnify, and they will extend the values and principles of the state or the group or the persons who wield them. There was a time when the dynamics of geopolitics would shape the direction of technology. I believe that in this century, we will find that technology will have a profoundly shaping influence on the geopolitics. Thus, in an era of technological advance, it's possible to see that the character of humanity is very much at stake, and the principled, values-based community of nations must come together to be on the right side of humanity, the right side of history, on this important global challenge. And today's conference is a major part of that conversation. So to close, I am really heartened to join so many leaders of character and values today. And for Brookings and ISPI, two institutions standing shoulder to shoulder as bastions of truth against the rise of illiberalism and authoritarianism, and to have co-authored this report, AI in the Age of Cyber Disorder, Actors, Trends, and Prospects. It is an honor for Brookings to partner with ISPI in this matter. It's a wonderful collection of papers, and I hope you'll give them all a good read. It's exactly the type of thinking that will see us through the coming decades. And so with that, I'll now turn it over to Fabio Ruge to kick off our panel discussion. And thank you, Gian Piero, for the opportunity to speak this morning. It is wonderful to see you and so many dear friends again.
Thank you very much, John. I must say that ISPI is truly honored to cooperate with Brookings, and I am personally honored to cooperate with you, my dear friend, John. And believe me, America is very much on our minds nowadays. It is for COVID, and it is also for this continuous ability that the United States always have shown to give new birth to its institutions and new energy on its inputs on the world. So this is why we are so deeply confident that this will happen again. And I also wanted to thank the Foreign Ministry and Leonardo Company. We are jointly promoting this center on cybersecurity, and this center already came and enabled a third annual conference to take place under the chair of Fabio Ruggeri, who is actually the head for ISPI of the Center on Cybersecurity. And I am particularly also pleased to underscore that this is the one we present today. It's our second joint report between Brookings and ISPI, and the words of General Allen about the content of the report make it all. That is, I also really invite you to read it carefully and to keep it carefully on our minds. So cyberspace became an immaterial battlefield, of course. It's the realm of ambiguity. The only thing is that threats are very real. So out from an immaterial world, we seriously risk to be hit as states, as countries, as governments, as country systems, as individuals. And just to make things even more complex, it is not only statal actors that are present in the virtual space, but also non-statal actors, a whole bunch of them. And all the state actors that are there, not all share the same beliefs. And to even make things even more complicated, cyberspace is the environment for AI. And the quality of AI technologies that, as John said, is neutral by itself as AI, is highly influenced by what the cyber environment looks like. And I must really say that nowadays the potentialities and also some activities that are already taking place are genuinely frightening. And I ask myself, what actually are the tools we dispose of? Do we really get into this kind of era, this kind of struggle with the right tools, with the right principles, with the right regulations? And I think that this will be a major challenge in the 21st century. As far as values are considered, allow me to say that the result of the American election seems encouraging to me. So thank you all very much. And I would invite the representative of Leonardo to take floor, please.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Thank you all for this opportunity. It's very interesting about the thoughts about the publication that I've just read, because as I said before, it's very important, the new era of machine learning that related to artificial intelligence, these other categories of deep learning. And without losing in technical effort, we can also understand that also the machine learning algorithms that are now so useful in our activity are broad and are usable in every field of the science. We also got two different broad categories of algorithms. The supervised algorithm that required a labeled training data set, often made by the human itself, that can train the algorithm to understand some phenomenon. And once trained, this algorithm should subsequently be able to correctly classify or predict data given new input. Most of these technical are reached by neural network architectures that are supervised algorithms. Conversely, unsupervised algorithms do not require any kind of labeled training data set. And typically, they use inherent data properties to subsequently predict or classify the data. An example for a supervised activity algorithms or machine learning we can find in cybersecurity for recurrent neural networks for understanding the difference between normal DNS domain name servers like google.com, that is a legitimate domain name server, or perhaps other those generated for domains generated algorithms, used for example, for making command and control servers for attacking infrastructure. Then it's very useful the activity of training a supervised algorithm to be, because the signature-based approach are useless here, because it's randomly generated domains are usually truly random and also change quite frequently to stay ahead to a signature approach. And also the approach based on linguistic analysis, for example, understanding the presence of consonant or vowels should not be effective for understanding this kind of approach. So it should be useful for making finding temporal structure in the sequence for understanding if one domain name service is real or perhaps is randomly generated. Another approach of unsupervised algorithm should be used for those that's called self-organization maps, for technical for understanding anomaly IP traffic. So in this kind of neural networks, there is a neuron that essentially represents a point in a multidimensional space, and every neuron is connected to its neighbors. But every time it's a new training sample is inserted in the multidimensional space, is presented to the self-organization map, then the closest neuron wins and moves closer to the training sample and pulls neighbor along with this. So this kind of approach is something automated. So you can directly take and leverage the inherent data properties of the network itself. Other application, this kind of approach we can see in cybersecurity for learning, detect malicious activity of certain attacks. For example, understanding also Internet of Things algorithm can be detected for data exfiltration attack. For example, using a connected fish tank as the entryway to the network. So understanding this behavior should be very useful, the approach of machine learning algorithms. The same kind of approach, for example, for mobile endpoints. So we can try to understand the technical of VPN approach of apps application, used in combination with a machine learning threat intelligence that can leverage and more efficiently protect the infrastructure of these mobile endpoints. But also the machine learning can be useful for enhanced human analysis, reviewing millions of logins each day by an operator. The system was able to filter data and pass it only to the human analyst the information that can be useful for analyzing, for understanding this kind of approach and behavior. So we can understand that it should be very effective, the use of artificial intelligence in protecting our infrastructure, our IT and IoT infrastructure, but can be also useful for making what is called proactive defense, where it's, as we heard before, about cyber warfare. So understanding more effectively the capability of an enemy, understanding how could be effective the approach at the attack for this kind of threats. The problem is that, as we can see before, any kind of infrastructure is based on IT in computers, and usually we cannot absolutely all control this infrastructure. So also the approach of using machine learning algorithms, supervised or not supervised, should be also the target itself of the attack. For example, we can have some influence in the developing and using of machine learning algorithms, for example, for causative attacks, where the targets have the training process as targeting of the attacks, and training data is altered before can be used for analyze the data. The model trained on the altered data provides the manipulated output, and this kind of attacks also called like poisoning attack. There is something that infects the data set that can be analyzed. There is also another kind of attack exploration that can be useful for understanding, to probe the learner and catching the useful information by the learner itself. So this kind of approach can exploit unclassification of the data and also without altering the training approach. And this kind of approach can also be specified because there is some targeted attack with it. You can target a specific point, an instance or a particular exploit in continuous streams, or perhaps an indiscriminate attack where the target is a general class of points, instance, or exploiting in a random non-target way. And this kind of approach can provocate three different security violations. The first is the integrity, because a successful attack on asset via false negative can be classified as normal attacks. So you can believe that it's the algorithm is working well, but instead it's altered, so the effectiveness, the activity of the algorithm itself is changed. Also the availability of attack, because if you are able to make a broad class of an attack that makes the system unusable with classification errors, denial service, false negative and positive, you are able to block the activity of using this kind of algorithms for using machine learning and so artificial intelligence. And at least also the privacy violation attacks, because an exploration attack type that reveals sensitive or confidential information from the data and the model can be absolutely useful for making a model extraction, inversion, or other kinds of attack. And this is very important, as I also had before, that this kind of technology is something that is based on the different approach to different countries that wish to gather this information superiority on artificial intelligence. So protecting not only the data, but also the algorithm is very interesting for trying to have a technological capacity for be clear, for have the right data, the right algorithms, and the right data can be useful for increase our response for cybersecurity or perhaps any kind of other activity that is supported by technologies.
Thank you. As we know, we have two panels now. The first one is governing the AI normative voids, and the second one is AI dystopias in contemporary worlds. And the first panel is led by Fabio Ruggia. I gave you, Fabio, the floor, please.
Thank you, Ambassador, and welcome to this third annual conference of the ISPI Center for Cybersecurity. The internet, born as an anarchic network to connect people across global frontiers, has become one of the most destabilizing area of competition between states. Cyberpower, in fact, is a key component of sovereignty in the 21st century. And the cyber domain is one of the preferred stage of the ongoing global great power competition. And this is the reason why we created the Center for Cybersecurity at ISPI, together with Leonardo, that supported us from the very beginning, in order to investigate the security implications of this new technology transformation underway, and to create awareness about the threats and the challenges that we face, both as a country and as the international community as a whole. This is also why, as Laura explained, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs decided to support this research. So thank you so much to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And we are very happy that Brookings decided to partner with us for the second time, in fact, for this annual report. Thank you, Ambassador Masolo. Thanks also to General Allen. The transformation enabled by the emergence of cybersecurity, of cyberspace, and the revolution that is underway from the security point of view are just at the beginning. In the second report of ISPI Cybersecurity Center, we investigated, together with Brookings, the security implications of the ongoing global race for technological superiority and the impact of disruptive technologies on the international security environment. But for the second report that we published together with Brookings, we decided instead to focus specifically on AI and on the threats and challenges that its development will pose to both human security and international security. The authors of this report also put forward ideas and proposals for mitigating these risks and for ensuring that we build trustworthy and responsible artificial intelligence. In light of this extraordinary impact the development of AI have on our individual social, economic, and political life, the authors of this report highlight how there is an urgent need for a political guidance that protects and promotes the goal of artificial intelligence as a public good. This is certainly true. We need that, and I believe that both Paolo and Darrell will tell us a little bit more about what can we do in order to promote artificial intelligence which is trustworthy. But the point is that from the point of view of international security, it's going to be very difficult to implement a coordinated approach to guide this process. And this is because artificial intelligence, in fact, is part of cyber. In a way, it is cyber. Because, well, of course, it is composed, it's a phenomenon which is based on hardware and software, on algorithms. And this is the reason why artificial intelligence will in fact oblige to the rules, the building blocks, the principles, the operating principles that apply to cyberspace. In fact, Floridi and Taddeo, which I quote in my chapter, say cyberspace is a domain of warfare and artificial intelligence is a new defense capability. To explain the relationship between artificial intelligence and cyber, I use the analogy of the Marxian base or substructure and superstructure, meaning that developments in the area of artificial intelligence will follow the same path that we have witnesses in the cyber domain, where conflict appears to be the natural state of things. Looking at artificial intelligence developments through the lens of disorder in the cyber domain helps explains also why artificial intelligence is bound to replicate and fast track the ongoing confrontation for attaining superiority in the cyber domain. The security paradox mounting in and around cyberspace will inevitably be reinforced by the developments underway in the field of artificial intelligence. And therefore, what we can expect, I would guess, is that we will see an acceleration of the threats to the confidentiality, the integrity, and the availability of data. We will witness an acceleration of the segmentation of the internet in different regional blocks. We will see a harsh confrontation of narratives already happening throughout the networks to influence perception and win heart and minds and destabilize, in fact, public opinions and manipulate the public discourse and the political debate. We will probably see even an ongoing decoupling of the global ICT supply chain and an acceleration of this decoupling. And a growing sense of distrust within the international community will also accelerate. And this is particularly troublesome because we desperately need international cooperation in today's volatile security environment. And also what we try to highlight in our chapter is the growing risk of escalations, of miscalculation, of unintended escalation cross-domain from the cyber domain, the algorithmic domain, to the conventional domain. Now, General Allen, in his introductory remark, noticed that we cannot even imagine the world that artificial intelligence is creating. But he also said that notwithstanding the fact that we do not imagine, we need to think ahead and start working on guiding this process. We cannot be reactive. We need to be proactive in the world of artificial intelligence. Now, I focus on 4 areas that the liberal democracies need to focus upon. The first one is that of understanding what is going on. We miss a comprehensive understanding of how the ongoing confrontation in cyberspace affects international security, stability, and links together the political, the military, the economic, the social sphere. In other words, what we need is an updating of the George Kennan's X telegram, right, to reflect the new strategic horizon brought about by the confrontation for superiority in cyberspace and algorithmic warfare. A second point is we need to defend our values. In the great power competition underway, probably values are the most important cleavage that is structuring the global power competition. And it is what really distinguishes us from the rest, from autocratic regimes. So we need to do whatever we can to promote a liberal, human-centric approach to the development of artificial intelligence. Then, of course, we need to maintain the technological superiority that has been historically associated with the supremacy of the Western world on the international system. We need to emerge in the race for technological superiority because, unfortunately, our liberty and our security will depend more and more on how secure and free the internet will be. And finally, we need to generate a political dialogue, a political debate, because it's only through a political debate that we are able to assign values, that we are able to identify priorities, that we are able to identify the path that we want to promote and the lines that we will not cross. This political debate is really essential if we want to, how can I say, start and depict what General Allen said. Try to think ahead, try to guide this process and see how we can promote, at least within our liberal democracies, an artificial intelligence which is trustworthy, and build the blocks for promoting an artificial intelligence which is sustainable and stable at the international level. Now, of course, I must really thank all the authors of the report which we launched today. And I must really thank both Paolo and Darrell because I'm really happy that they decided to contribute. And because in both chapters that they decided to present for this report, they, in different perspectives, I believe, really come out with an idea which is not too dissimilar, which is we need a value-based approach that is able to structure the governance that we need. The governance that we need for ensuring, once again, the protection of our values and the promotion of their promotion at the global level. As I said, both Paolo and Darrell try to promote and come up with solutions, ideas, proposals. I think they are both really interesting, and I strongly encourage those that are listening to us to follow through the book and see how what they say. Paolo has been with the Franciscan Third Order Regular since 1999. His studies have included engineering, philosophy, theology, and his doctorate was in the area of bioethics. He is a professor of moral theology, bioethics, neuroethics at the Gregorian, and he's a member of Agenzia per l'Italia Digitale and the Prime Minister's Office. He's also the author of many books. The last one, I believe, is Homo Faber, the Techno-Human Condition. And his chapter is full of moral ground, moral thinking on how we shall work to advance the cause of responsible and trustworthy artificial intelligence. Paolo, without much further ado, I would love if you could please present your work. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Fabio. I'm really honored, and it's a privilege to be here with you today. I'm really happy of what the ambassador and the general said. In one really personal perspective, I'm a son of that friendship of the two sides of the pond, because a part of my PhD was made in Georgetown, and so my formation is made both sides. And I know very well Washington, D.C. as a really nice city to live on. Well, what is the perspective of an ethicist? Talking about AI, talking about technology. Let me be back to a really huge paper that I discovered during my formation. The paper was written in the 80s by Langdon Winner, and the title of the paper gives the perspective that I would like to suggest to simple enter inside the chapter that you asked me. The title was "Do Artifact Has Politics?" And Langdon Winner for MIT simple stress out that technical arrangement are form of order. Langdon Winner was used to look at the bridge over the parkway on Long Island. And looking at the bridge of the park of Long Island, Langdon was used to say, look, no one is asking what does it mean. But if you look, the clearance is just 9 feet, 3 meters. And that was made on purpose to not allow the minority with buses to reach the beach. Was just made to allow the white middle class to reach the beach with their car. So the perspective of an ethicist on technology is to see through, to see which kind of form of order is beside the technology. And as an ethicist, I'm not here to give you answer or moral law, but just to make what the first ethicist, like Socrates, was used to do. A form of questioning that probably Rilke, in Letter to a Young Poet, was used to summarize in the sentence, you have to leave now the question, and probably one day you will find the answer. So let me question the topic of AI and the developing technology that is changing the way in which we understand the agency, that is changing probably also the way in which can shift the power on produce a form of order inside the global world. First of all, there are new kind of organized relationship between the human beings. We know in the old Greek city that when we discover ourselves as a citizen, we simply made something really clear. We give to everyone right and duty. Then when we discover that the association, industrial association of people live together, we discover another kind of person. It's the legal person. The industry, it's a legal person. And we give rights and duty also to this kind of organization. Now we have this algorithm that has a way of autonomy and agency inside the social interaction. And this kind of social interaction are outside of every kind of regulation or law between us. So the fact that the personal relationship and human relationship and also some kind of machine can simply adapt themselves, act, and produce connection, make of that kind of machine some kind of entity that should be controlled by society to allow a coexistence in peace, to allow a coexistence that do not result themselves like an evolutionary war between what we can call machina sapiens and provocative machina sapiens and Homo sapiens. So to coexist, we have to open up the algorithm. We have to be able to see what inside, because we know that algorithms simply decide on data, and deciding on data can produce bias, can produce a new form of injustice, can produce new form of difference that could be not so much compatible with the value that we put at the base of our society. So to avoid this kind of struggle, we should open up this kind of black box and make it trustable. That is really different from transparency, because sometimes this box has to be not transparent to protect also the security or something that is behind, but make it trustable in a way that society can in some way trust and achieve is one of the first questions that an ethicist asks to the public. The second thing is that these algorithms are the production of a huge compartment of the industry, one of the biggest now. The big tech is now the prominent section of the production. And it's really interesting that the IT tech industries now can in some way exceed the dimension of every national state and can in some way also surrogate some function that before was relied just on a national state. Simple thing was happening with ID. To access to a lot of global services is not anymore necessary my passport. It's enough a login and ID that is given me from this big company. Or things to what happened to the money. Money before was issued by a country or a state. Now is surrogating by the IT complex. Or think to what happened to education. Online education or education provided by IT that before was something that is state-driven or state guarantee, now it's given inside this company. So the dimension of this company, the dimension of the aggregation of the technological, IT technological sector is questioning us in which way we can still talk about democracy, still talk about balance of power between the different entities of society. You know, the same thing was stressed by Landon Winner, the author of the paper that I quoted before, in the 80s, when we saw to the mechanization of the harvesting of tomato in California. The price of that machine transformed the market of tomatoes because only the biggest company can afford that kind of machine, and they push the little farmer out of the market, making a concentration of the market. So the high technological investment of the algorithm produce a concentration of the market on the other side, making of this huge big company new subject that has to be in dialogue with political power, with the civil society. And that happened also for the amount of data that are the fuel in some way. It's not perfectly equivalent, but it's like the fuel for this new engine of AI. And at least the last point that an ethicist saw in the AI field is also the fact that when AI is not just an invention, but is something that is distributed as a service inside the society, something that happened in the past could happen again. The same thing happened with electrical power. When electrical power was discovered by Edison, it's not Edison the key point to transform the society with electricity. We have to look for the West to Samuel Insull, one of the founder of General Electric Company, that make of electrical power a utility that can simply transform the society, the civil production, and also the national security and defense. But on the other side, if you look at what happened in Russia with Goelro, the Lenin plan to develop Russia, we can show that it happened through electrification of Russia. Goelro was the plan to distribute electrical power as a utility. And here we face the same things with artificial intelligence. The way in which we distribute it as a service, the way in which we make of AI a utility that will be used inside the productional sectors and also the other part of society will produce a development model, will realize or fight a democracy model or a power model. So with this outlook, with this kind of scenario, an ethicist like me simply propose a way to handle or to cope with this kind of transformation. And the way it's really old, the way in which we have to cope with technology and tools that could be also weapon, has an old name, that is ethics. But now this form of coping has to be understood not only by human agent, has to be understood also by algorithmical agent. And this is the way why we have to write a new chapter of this long book of a long human journey in a way that also the algorithm can understand, the machine can understand, and how to execute. To using another image, coming back to the parkway, which I have started by, we have to make ethical guardrail to drive this new car to the right ending of the journey. And to do that, I simply suggest to make a union between algorithm and ethic, and I suggest the word algorithmics to describe this new chapter that has to be made by coding ethics to make this tool most similar to the way in which we want as a human being, and also to develop a series of tools for company, because with the transformation of AI, algorithmic has to question also the company to produce a cultural shift, to produce a management formation, to produce a policymaker understanding of the kind of transformation that we are facing, and give to everyone the right tools to decide what is the best option for the evolution that they desire, for the innovation that they would like to produce, to develop company, country, and so on in a compatible way with the values base that we have chosen. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paolo, very much. Very, very interesting, and thank you again for your contribution to this report. I now give the floor to Darrell West, who is the Vice President of Governance Studies, and a Senior Fellow of the Center for Technology Innovation at the Brookings Institution. He holds a Douglas Dillon Chair in Government Studies. His current research focuses on American politics, technology policy, and artificial intelligence. He just published, together with General Allen, a book which is called Turning Point, Policymaking in the Era of Artificial Intelligence. And he's a winner of the American Political Science Association Don K. Prize Award for Best Book on Technology, and the American Political Science Association Doris Graeber Award for Best Book on Political Communication. So without much further ado, Darrell, thank you so much for participating to this panel, to this report. I understand that human safety, individual freedom, national security, and societal well-being increasingly depend on artificial intelligence and how it is implemented. The risks, as you write, are raising stark inequalities, lack of personal privacy, widespread unfairness, political authoritarianism. So what steps can we take to promote a trustworthy and responsible AI in the face of all these threats and challenges?
Well, thank you, Fabio. It's nice to be with you. I appreciate you and your colleagues organizing this conference. And it's great to follow Pablo's presentation as well, because I think, as you mentioned, his perspective on the importance of ethicists fits very nicely with the things that I argue in my papers. So there are lots of exciting changes taking place in the AI world, but as you and the other speakers have pointed out, AI is raising many issues in terms of operations and public policy. And you mentioned the new book that John Allen and I have about AI entitled Turning Point. And we wrote this book because we think AI is the transformative technology of our time. It's being deployed in sectors from healthcare and education to transportation, e-commerce, and national defense. We present in-depth case studies of AI in each of those areas, look at how it's being used, what the opportunities are, but then also what risks are being posed. And we chose the title of Turning Point because we think the world is at a major inflection point that could lead either to utopia or dystopia. And the crucial variable in determining which of those futures we end up with is public policy. So we present a detailed policy blueprint and suggest if we take appropriate actions, we're actually very confident about the future. But if we don't do certain things, the world could go off the rails pretty quickly. So there are lots of different problems and lots of different worries that people have expressed about AI in terms of the basic fairness of the system, various types of biases, racial, gender, age, and other types of problems of that sort, lack of transparency, like people don't really understand how algorithms operate. what are the principles that are built into them, on what data are they trained, how these software systems operate. There's concerns about the impact on human safety, thinking about applications such as autonomous vehicles in the transportation area. Are they actually going to be safe? And then the question of mass surveillance in authoritarian systems clearly is a big issue that we need to pay attention to. And one of the interesting questions is a basic governance question of who should decide. Because in the past, we have delegated much of the decision-making in these areas to private companies and basically had them decide which applications to develop, how to deploy them, to whom to sell them, and so on. But increasingly, people want more engagement. They want more public involvement in the process, more public oversight, and more public regulation. So I do think we are at a point where we're starting to move into a new era with much broader engagement and oversight in terms of how AI operates. And as Fabio noted, in our paper, we talk about various ways to build more responsible AI. And the ethics concerns certainly need to be paramount. We need to build value-based systems of AI. We need to think about what are the ethical principles on which we want our AI to rest, and then how do we go about implementing those things. So we have talked in a number of different settings about the importance of the tech companies hiring ethicists so that it's not just people with technical skills and the software coders who decide what the AI is and how it operates, but ethicists need to be involved in product development and product deployment so that we can ensure ethical considerations are part of the process. We also suggest companies need to develop AI review boards so that they can start thinking about these possible ramifications very early in the product cycle. In our paper, we suggest that countries start to think about what we call AI impact assessments. These are similar to the environmental impact statements that were developed 50 years ago in the United States. At that point in time, people were worried about economic development projects and the possible ramifications for the environment. And so large-scale projects that were publicly funded at that point were required to develop environmental impact statements in which they would talk about the impact of the economic development on the environment and how to mitigate possible problems, how to deal with environmental harms, how to address some of the side effects of those developments. We think that AI is so important that we need AI impact assessments as well for large-scale publicly funded projects. And these impact statements would basically look at how the AI is being deployed, the number of people being affected, and what the possible ramifications are. We want these statements to try and anticipate possible problems and think about how to mitigate them. We need to integrate the problem solving with the product development, which we're not really doing right now, but we think we need to do in the future in order to build responsible AI. We also need to improve digital access as a general principle. I'm not sure what the numbers are in Italy and throughout the rest of Europe, but in the United States, roughly about 15 to 20% of Americans remain outside the digital revolution, meaning they either don't have access to the internet or they have very slow speed broadband so that they can't really use the internet very effectively. And today, you basically need digital access in order to do almost anything. There are a number of companies in the United States that have moved to online job applications. So if you don't have digital access, you can't apply for jobs. COVID has accelerated technological innovation and basically pushed what might have been 5 years of change into 5 months. We see this in terms of virtual learning, and many schools have moved to online education. In the healthcare area, relying on telehealth or video conferencing in order to access physician consultations, growing reliance on e-commerce Bricks and mortar stores are starting to disappear, and more people are shopping online. And then, of course, the rise of remote work. At Brookings, we've been on remote work since March. We're going to continue that through June of next year. And a lot of organizations are adapting to remote work. But all that presupposes that people have digital access. And so if you don't have digital access, it creates enormous inequities in terms of education, healthcare, transportation, e-commerce, and the ability to work. Racial bias and gender-based biases are big problems with AI. There have been well-documented problems in a number of different areas. So we suggest independent audits of AI just to see what types of impact they're having on various groups. Is there a disparate impact across protected categories? And then again, what we should do to address those problems if we do find them. One of the biggest challenges in the AI area is the training data that are used to develop the AI, because the AI is only as good as the data. And some of the bias problems that we see arise from training data that are either incomplete or unrepresentative of the broader population. And so in order to improve the AI and in order to reduce the bias, we need better access to data. So there are public data sources via government that need to be made available to researchers and product developers so that they can do a better job developing this. Of course, we have to maintain privacy as these data resources are developed, but it's really important to get the data piece right if we want the software to function fairly and equitably. The last point that I will mention is just the importance of maintaining human control over the technology. And John Allen mentioned this in the national defense area. Increasingly, there's an emphasis on autonomous lethal weapons systems and basically keeping humans out of the loop in terms of how those targeting decisions are being made. We have a long chapter in our book kind of looking at the ethical aspects of military AI applications, how AI is being used in the national defense space, kind of some of the misuses of AI in terms of human surveillance. And so there are lots of ways in which we need to make sure that the AI protects basic human values and that humans remain in the loop. We don't want the AI to operate so autonomously and so independently that we don't know how it's operating, we don't know on what principles it's making decisions, and that we aren't part of the process. So maintaining human control is a big part of developing a responsible AI. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Darrell. Very, very interesting. We still have a few minutes in our panel, so I'll take full advantage of those minutes, and I will ask first to my old friend Massimo Tedeschi. We have been discussing how important it is to build a trustworthy artificial intelligence, but we also know that the cyber domain is the domain of ambiguity and of asymmetry. So my question to you, as the CTO of Leonardo, is: do you believe it's possible to balance the need for a trustworthy artificial intelligence at the domestic level within at least the group of liberal democracies to which we belong, in a context in which there is such a big conflict underway? The cyber dimension, the cyber conflict dimension is so relevant. Can we get the best of two worlds? Can we defend ourselves while promoting a trustworthy artificial intelligence at the domestic level? Massimo.
Thank you, Fabio. I suppose that it's the same paradigm that we have also in cybersecurity itself. You know that sometimes we are trying to reduce the attack surface and not reducing at all the risk of the attack on IT infrastructure. I suppose that the same kind of approach should be also applied to artificial intelligence or the products of artificial intelligence. For example, also in Europe and Italy, we have some effort in protecting the data itself, because we talked about before that you can also attack the data itself, the data lake that that are the base of the technical artificial intelligence algorithm. For example, for the GPDR is a very interesting tool that we can try to protect the capability of protecting the information, perhaps also the subject of the local law, of national laws that can try to make some rules about using the data. The problem is that sometimes, everyone has tried to sign any kind of subscription, and you have to read the paper of how your data have managed, but sometimes the awareness of the citizen is sometimes not loosened, because you try to gather the advantage of using this kind of services without thinking about how your data can be used well. So I suppose it should be very important to increase the awareness of the citizen, understanding how can be misused our personal information, our personal data. The second approach is try to protect the algorithm itself. Also, like Professor Benati says, we are trying to make transparent and trust the algorithm itself, because sometimes we have to think how we can include inside the algorithms the human values by try to balancing between different possible choices. I've read something about, for example, insurance companies that gather information about the risk of people that can subscribe an insurance, and perhaps you can assist in the future that some companies did not subscribe any kind of insurance for me if I have some problems for my health problem, any kind of activity. So we can have a different, not democratic approach of artificial intelligence. So as we try in the printing revolution that wider the use of knowledge, making a distribution of knowledge, we can try to use the same kind of approach, try to guiding the use of artificial intelligence. For example, try to leave, as also Mr. West have said before, that we can leave to the human the capability, the possibility of changing the decision, or perhaps make a supervision of the decision. Like I remember in my long-term records, the War Games film, that at least the decision of pushing the red button is not so easy to leave to a machine, but can be also the human that have to decide. Especially in the cyber attack, I suppose that like in a kinetic attack, we have to leave at least a recovery button that can be in the hand of the human, of the decision maker, more than machine. Fabio, make the mute on mic.
Sorry, here I am. Do you hear me now? Yes. All right. So sorry about that. The very briefly to Paolo, once again, on the idea of asymmetry. Paolo, in your chapter, you discuss extensively the reasons why we need an ethical approach to artificial intelligence. But unfortunately, around the globe, certain states do not share the same ethic approach that you propose. Of course, the artificial intelligence we have seen is certainly part of the great power competition underway. So, and there are states that do not cherish the same values of liberal democracy. So my question to you is, what are the limits to which we can propose a one-size-fits-all ethics? Can we promote some certain general global principles, do you believe, that can guide the international community as such towards these new threats and challenges that we need to face?
According to an ethical point of view, the first ethical duty is to allow the decision makers to understand and decide according to his own sensibility. So, for example, probably we could have a manager that is in charge to make an automation process in quality recognizing of some kind of mass production, for example, things like nail or things like that, and allow him to decide which kind of AI fit better his own duty, is the first ethical point. Then it depends when you have like a lot of time in the cyber area, when a final solution is the production of and the assembly of a lot of different layers, in which it's not so easy to understand who wrote what and what is inside. And this is another complexity level that we have to clarify. Just if you think to a simple piece of code for the today, nowadays, like Windows 3.1, there are alone 3 million code lines. So of course, when you talk about an AI solution, you talk a really complex project that is not so easy to handle. But we have other field of action that has similar fitting similar model. For example, European community has a machine directive that apply to every single machine that has to be sold in the European Union market. The machine directive gives some ethical line, some ethical directive on the safety of the mechanical machine, the saw machine, and other kind of machine that has to be handled by a worker in the European Union. So also have an analogous kind of directive for the AI technology that will impact the market, means that that kind of technology has to be compliance with some kind of general framework that allow them to be compatible to the safety of the operators and people. But at the end of that, because every single AI solution is trained on a model, and the model, it's not just simple the replication of the reality, is an assumption of a reality. Imagine that you have to train your machine learning system to recognize cat. At one point, when you have, after 1 million of cat images, a little tiger, the way in which you say it's cat or is not cat, is an I have cat, is the base truth that is inside your system. I make it really simple and really clear to say that there is no neutral artifact. And if you don't know what is the base truth of your system, it's impossible that you can decide if it's fit or not fit. So if you would like to use this kind of imaging software recognition, just to remain inside this silly example, to recognize if you have a pet and you can simply touch the pet safely, and the producer of the base truth say that a little tiger is a safe pet because it's a cat, it's better if you are insured, if you produce that kind of app. So this is simple to say, it's really complex, it's multiple stakeholder, and you need a complex solution. If one ethical measure fit all means to not leave the complexity, it never works.
Okay, very, very interesting. Thank you, Paolo. One last question to Darrell with the few minutes that we have left. Darrell, again, an asymmetry, in fact, let alone the problem of applying, of ensuring artificial intelligence development globally, which is compatible with international security. But in cyber defense, we always say that cyber is a team sport. And that we need to partner with all of us that, like us, are defending against threats. We need to create bridges, build bridges to put together, to make closer like-minded people that think the same. So my question to you is, how can we promote artificial intelligence as a vector to create stability within the community of liberal democracies? What can we do to bridge the gap, for instance, for those states that are not able, do not have the means to develop an artificial intelligence strategy? How can we make sure that we do our utmost to promote an artificial intelligence which is non-conflictual at the international level?
That's a great question, and I think you have hit the key issue in terms of international issues, which is we need to be talking with other countries. Like, this is not an issue where every country should just be kind of going its own way. You know, in other areas, in terms of national defense, military applications, climate change, countries are talking to one another and trying to develop new norms in terms of the use of a technology in particular areas. So we argue we need to be doing exactly the same thing in regard to AI. So for example, the world held the Geneva Convention and argued, countries agreed not to torture prisoners of war. We did international agreements on nuclear weapons, on the use of chemical weapons. You can kind of go down the list of tough topics where countries came together and reached an agreement and developed enforcement mechanisms for those agreements. We need to be doing exactly the same thing today in regard to AI. We need to be talking both to our friends in Europe as well as to potential adversaries and work out what the rules of engagement are going to be, what the rules of deployment are going to be, what are the human guardrails that need to be put in place in order to safeguard. I mean, the goal is really to develop AI for the social good. There are many very responsible AI applications that we're already seeing in the environmental sustainability area, for example. AI is being a big help just in monitoring climate change and improving the sustainability of green buildings and so on. So these are the types of things that we need to do as a global community to kind of pull together. The worst situation is kind of our current situation where there are no agreed upon international norms, and that creates the potential for chaos. It creates unpredictability. It creates the problem of misperception, that countries may misperceive what an adversary is doing and then respond in a way that further destabilizes the situation. That's what we need to avoid as we start to move forward.
Well, thank you, Dalia. That's a perfect closing, because I guess of this first panel, because I guess these bring us back to what both General Allen and Ambassador Marsolo were saying regarding the need to develop tools and thinking both at the diplomatic and institutional level to come up with solutions to the problem that you presented, Dalia. Thank you so much. So we came to the close of this first panel. Without much further ado, thanking all the panelists, I would like to pass the floor to Caitlin Chin, another author of this ISPI Brookings report. She's a research analyst at the Brookings Institute, Center for Technological Innovation. She contributed at Brookings to research on privacy, artificial intelligence, antitrust, and broadband policy. So Caitlin, thank you so much for your contribution, your excellent contribution. And without much further ado, the floor is yours and to your panel. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Fabio, and good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our next panel, AI Dystopias in Contemporary Worlds. Earlier in the conference, we've heard how government approaches are essential to the development of AI and why we need ethical principles and policies in order to address issues of security, fairness, equity, privacy, and international relations. And now I'm looking forward to continuing this discussion with our next panelists, Samuele Dominioni, who is a research fellow here at ISPI, and Thomas Campbell, who is the founder and CEO of FutureGrasp. Each of us has written a chapter for the second ISPI and Brookings report on AI, and I'm excited to discuss our research today. So first, I'll talk a little about my chapter, which is about gender issues in artificial robots and voice assistants. And then I'll ask Samuele to share an overview of his research on AI-enabled surveillance in authoritarian regimes. And finally, we'll move to Thomas to discuss AI national strategies and cybersecurity. So my chapter is called How AI Bots and Voice Assistants Reinforce Gender Bias. I co-authored it with one of my colleagues at the Brookings Institution, Michela Robison, and we take a look at some of the gender issues surrounding the rise of artificial intelligence. Our research was actually inspired in part by a book called The Future of Work, which was written by my colleague, Daryl West, who spoke earlier in the conference. The Future of Work describes how technology is changing the labor market. And one point I was especially interested in was how the use of robots is expanding around the world. The book highlights examples of how artificial robots are currently being used in the service industry or in customer-facing roles, including nanny robots in China, robots at a hotel in Japan that take reservations and speak Japanese and English, a security guard robot named Steve in Washington Harbor, or Aristotle, a robot with a woman's voice that reads bedtime stories to babies, even social robots that can pick up groceries and keep people company. The future of work is a topic that has fascinated many researchers, and this issue has primarily been examined through an economic and political lens. However, my co-author Michela and I decided to instead focus on issues of gender and inclusivity. As we discussed in our chapter, companies may have an economic incentive to humanize customer-facing AI, since there is some evidence that people like using products that they relate to. And as branches of AI like natural language processing and emotion AI advance, these digital tools have the capability of becoming increasingly realistic, human-like, and widely available. Therefore, it is crucial to consider how artificial bots depict gender and existing gender job stereotypes, especially since some of the largest gender gaps we see today are in the workforce. Some of this work has already been started. There have been some academic articles and research done on the topic of gender and AI, and companies have made some progress on these issues. But of course, there is still more progress to be made and still some questions left unanswered. So in our research, we build on the work of scholars like Clifford Nass, Sophia Noble, and many others, including at UNESCO and the AI-Now Institute. Back in the 1990s, Clifford Nass and Byron Reeves at Stanford University found that individuals exhibited similar behaviors with TVs and computers as they did with other humans. So not only did people treat the machines with respect, but they also interacted with male-sounding and female-sounding computer voices differently. Furthermore, gendered computer voices alone were enough to elicit different behaviors from people, even when all other gender cues, such as appearance, were missing from the computers. More recently, several analyses and reports have been published that focus specifically on US voice assistants, like Siri, Alexa, Cortana, and Google Assistant, which are hugely popular and collectively control over 92% of US market share for smartphone assistants, and with approximately 3 billion currently in use. Voice assistants have traditionally featured female-sounding voices, although some have undergone updates since their initial release. A 2019 UNESCO report described how the prominence of female-sounding voice assistants encourages stereotypes of women as submissive and compliant. And UCLA professor Sophia Noble has recently described how they can function as powerful socialization tools. Last year, the AI-Now Institute released a report describing how algorithms can become a feedback loop based on the backgrounds and demographics of the developers who create them. And Princeton professor Ruha Benjamin has written how technology glitches actually reflect a lack of diversity within their development teams. And so in our research, my co-author Michela and I argue that anytime we discuss the portrayal of gender in AI products, we need to take a close look at the demographic composition of the teams that develop these products. And ultimately, there is a lack of diversity within the STEM pipeline and workforce. In 2015, only about 1/5 of students graduating with a US bachelor's degree in engineering identified as a woman. And this percentage is consistent with the nationwide number of software developers and computer engineers that currently identify as women in the United States. These same gender disparities exist within companies that develop voice assistants. And overall, Black and Latino women hold fewer than 1.5% of leadership positions in Silicon Valley. In our research, we do acknowledge that voice technology is relatively new. Voice assistants like Siri, Cortana, Alexa, and Google Assistant were first launched within the past decade. And in fact, there has been some positive progress on certain issues over the past couple years. One of these areas of progress is actually Silicon Valley's approach to gender-based harassment. 3 years ago, in 2017, Quartz reporter Leah Fessler analyzed how Siri, Alexa, Cortana, and Google Assistant responded to sexual gender-based comments, and she found that these voice assistants were evasive, subservient, and sometimes their answers were even thankful. But when we conducted this study again in July 2020, we discovered that each of the 4 voice assistants had since been updated after Fessler's original 2017 article, and they now respond to harassment in a more negative manner. So this does reflect some positive progress in how tech companies address serious gender issues in voice assistants, but there is still more work to be done. One related consideration is how artificial bots must be held accountable for errors or bias in their content moderation algorithms. For example, in 2019, researchers discovered that Google Assistant, Siri, and Alexa had different accuracy rates when understanding user questions about vaccines. And another study tested the abilities of common speech recognition systems to transcribe spoken language and discovered a 16 percentage point gap in accuracy between Black participants' voices and white participants' voices. Therefore, the benefits of rejecting this harassing gender-based speech are accompanied by the need for fairness and accuracy in content moderation, and we must look at disparate accuracy rates by users' demographic characteristics. Ultimately, we argue that companies should develop industry-wide standards for the humanization of AI and collect and publish data relating to gender and diversity in their products and teams. We also describe how governments, universities, technology companies, and other organizations need to work together to address gender disparities in the workforce and education, and especially in engineering positions. And I just want to highlight that first issue because right now there are no guidelines on how companies should depict gender and human-like robots, and this is an area where businesses would benefit from clarity. Any guideline should be developed with input from academia, civil society, and civil liberties groups, and should include guidance on when is it appropriate to humanize AI, how to define voices considered male or female, or gender neutral, gender ambiguous, and non-binary, and when each voice would be appropriate to use. We also need guidelines on how to define gender-based harassment in the context of automated bots or voice assistants, and how bots should respond when such harassment occurs. Furthermore, how to reach achievable metrics for accuracy in speech recognition and hold companies accountable for reducing errors. And importantly, we need to discuss ways to promote active contributions from AI developers who reflect diverse populations, including the diversity of gender identity, sexual orientation, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic background, and location. And finally, guidelines must consider current social norms, especially when developing voice assistants to be deployed in multiple countries. And so to conclude my remarks, discussions of gender are essential to creating socially beneficial AI. We need to continue to question gender representation of voice assistants in any other future AI products, and we need to continue these conversations as future AI emerges. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our next panelist, Samuele Dominioni, who is a research fellow at ISPI, for an overview of his research on artificial intelligence and surveillance in authoritarian regimes. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Kathleen. As you said, I'm Samuele Dominioni, and I'm working as a research fellow at the ISPI Center on Cybersecurity, and I'm pleased to be here to give a short overview of the analysis that I carry out as one of the chapters that composes the report that has been published this morning, which is a result of a fruitful collaboration between ISPI and Brookings. And in my chapter, as you mentioned, I'm focusing on the challenges that non-democratic regimes might pose to both their own polities, meaning their citizens and their users, as well as for the international community when it comes to the use of artificial intelligence, in particular for surveillance purposes. So what is all about? What is surveillance? Maybe none of us is aware about what we're talking about. And in order to respond, first of all, to this answer, I look at one of the greatest scholars on surveillance studies, which is David Lyon, that defines surveillance as a systematic and routine attention to personal detail for purposes of influence, management, protection, or direction. Of course, surveillance studies is a long stream of research that pays a lot of tribute to Michel Foucault, the French philosopher, and in particular regarding the concept of panopticon. And so I also look whether this classic concept, such as the panopticon, can still be applied and can still be useful to understand what's going on in cyberspace and with the use of artificial intelligence for surveillance purposes. So for those who might not be familiar with the concept of panopticon, let me just say that it's a concept that has been used by, as I said, Foucault, several times to talk about surveillance and discipline in modern society. And but the panopticon itself was an architectural project for prisons that was drafted by another philosopher, a British one, Jeremy Bentham, and it consisted of a round shape prisons where the inmates, the prisoners, were staying in the outskirts of this circle along the circumference, whereas the guards were staying in the tower in the middle. And thanks to an architecture of glasses and lights, the prisoners could not see the guards, but the guards could observe them. And thus the prisoners were feeling a sort of invisible omnipresence. And building on this, Foucault argued that the concept of a persistent but invisible presence of the power was applied in Western countries beyond penal institutions and reached many different sectors of society, from school to factories. And it was achieved through discipline and the possibility of being punished. I think that this concept can still be useful to describe the dynamics of power in our digitalized society. And in Western countries, the panopticon might have lost part of its original punishment purpose. But it finds a new raison d'etre in what Shoshana Zuboff calls the surveillance capitalism. But this is not the topic of my chapter. Indeed, in other countries, in other parts of the world, the panopticon has been updated to technological developments, and it is now a fundamental pillar of the organizational power of many regimes, which in particular non-democratic regimes. And when I'm saying non-democratic regimes, I'm referring to a wide variety of countries and systems that for example, from the so-called democracy with adjectives, such as electoral democracies, sovereign democracies, to full authoritarian or even totalitarian regimes. And so in these regimes, we have been observing a very interesting phenomenon. In less than 2 decades, the so-called information communication technologies have passed from being a power for contestation. Everyone remember, for example, the Arab Spring revolutions, to an instrument for repression. And as a matter of fact, authoritarian regimes have understood and have learned how to use and to turn technology on their side to exploit its capabilities to monitor and to repress their polities. And I guess that many of you have heard or are aware about the Chinese social credit system. This is a project that aims to link public and private data on financial and social behavior of Chinese citizens across China, and to evaluate their behavior as individuals or organizations, and therefore to punish or rewarding them according to certain standards of appropriate conduct. So this is basically, to go back to our to the concept of panopticon, this is really a concretization, a realization of a panopticon 2.0. And indeed, as it was for the original panopticon, its effectiveness rests on the fact that it functions as a kind of laboratory of power, where thanks to this mechanism of observation, it can affect men and women's behavior. But how does this system work? Well, at the heart of this, there is on one side the growing digitalization of our society that allows to gather a huge amount of data, big data. And on the other, there is an increasingly computational power and artificial intelligence. And surveillance technologies are spreading very fast, and we should not be surprised, as these technologies are quite cheap and pervasive. And on top of this, as we have been saying since the beginning of this talk, there is a lack of normative solution at international level that can rule both on cyberspace and on the use of artificial intelligence technologies. And so the result are new forms of surveillance, which would have been unthinkable just a few decades ago. And this is both from a quantitative and from a qualitative standpoint. And nowadays, at least 78 out of 176 countries that adopted artificial intelligence technologies are actively using artificial intelligence for surveillance purposes. And many others will follow for the reason we said so far, cheap and pervasive. And guess what? Most of them are non-democratic regimes. Indeed, 56 out of these 78 countries using artificial intelligence for surveillance purposes are non-democratic, are authoritarian regimes. Then we can ask ourselves why authoritarian regimes are so much into surveillance practices than other regimes type. And here the answer is pretty straightforward. Authoritarian regimes are physiologically insecure, and they suffer, according to some scholars, from two main uncertainties, institutional and informational. The first one refers to the problem of security, meaning that authoritarian rulers have always to prevent, to detect, to contain threats to their hold on power. And the second one, the informational, is that the dictators can never know when and how good they are to prevent and to detect and to contain these threats, and so to remain in power. Therefore, AI-enabled surveillance programs, through their capacity to grasp and to crunch data from the entire polities, reduces both these uncertainties. And here I'm going to conclude, and I would like to stress the fact that the lack of normative solution, the lack of normative principle at international level somehow does not help this Panopticon 2.0 to realize, to spread. Actually, given the current fragmentation, the fragmentation that Fabio Rugges mentioned in his opening speech, cyberspace of different governance model of cyberspace could actually become, could actually push this Panopticon 2.0 to become more diffuse, as far as non-democratic regimes are also more and more prone to share best practices among themselves in order to exploit these new technologies. And indeed, the misuse of artificial intelligence enabled surveillance programs is connected to the broader issues and concept of digital privacy, data ownership, and data management, and finally to digital sovereignty. Therefore, as far as we won't be, there won't be an agreement on these principles among the international community, the current AI surveillance dystopia won't cease. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much. That was an incredibly informative overview of how AI enables surveillance, especially under authoritarian governments. I look forward to discussing more at the end of the panel, but for now, let's turn to Thomas Campbell, founder and CEO of FutureGrasp, for an introduction to his work on cybersecurity in AI national strategies. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Caitlin. And first off, I'd like to thank ISPI and Brookings for the honor to speak and to participate in your book contribution as well. So I particularly appreciate all the comments from the past panelists, and I will make a couple co-comments to augment the excellent already submissions in that context. So if you don't mind, I'm going to actually go into a PowerPoint here and share a screen so that you can actually see some of the graphics that I would like to discuss. It's a little bit easier to do this than verbally. So can you see that okay, Caitlin and everybody? Great. So I'm going to move there we go over there. So as mentioned, I'm Tom Campbell. I'm the founder and CEO of FutureGrasp. We are a global advisory group that I formed actually after I departed my service in the US government, in which I was the senior most analyst in the entire intelligence community as the first national intelligence officer for technology within the National Intelligence Council of the Office of Director of National Intelligence. That was roughly 3 years ago. And since then, we've been working with governments, intergovernmental organizations, such as United Nations, Interpol, corporations, startups, and a broad swath of think tanks, such as the great people at Brookings Institution. So I'm going to be speaking about my book chapter contribution, Cybersecurity and AI National Strategies. And then because of its timeliness, I'd also like to touch upon what the potential implications in the Biden-Harris administration incoming might be. So just as a sweeping overview in the beginning, how many AI national strategies are there? There are a lot, actually. So I published with the United Nations Interregional Crime and Justice Research Institute, or UNICRI, a seminal report back in July of 2019 called Artificial Intelligence Overview of State Initiatives. of assessing basically all the AI national strategies that existed, or the countries which had interest, and we describe them as shown in the bullet to the left, in an AI national strategy. Since then, there have been about, I'd say 20 on more. So you see here the master list. This is good as of February 2020. I actually checked the OECD website just earlier this week or last week, and it's identical to what OECD has. So it's pretty current. I suspect there haven't been a lot of activities in AI national strategies because of the pandemic. It's very difficult to get government senior policymakers together, though I am in conversations with countries such as Ireland and others who are very aggressively pursuing theirs right now. So the interesting thing to me is not so much who's on, who actually has an AI national strategy, but in some ways who doesn't. So the main reason I wanted to show the PowerPoint slides is to show this graphic of the global distribution. So you can show the list of countries there very well, but the interesting thing to me and the United Nations is not so much who has a state with an AI national initiative, who has interest, but who doesn't. And as so well clarified by Samuela just in the last speaking engagement, there are a number of countries which are being influenced heavily by autocratic nations such as China. So particularly parts of South America, almost all of Africa, most of Middle Eastern Europe, and Central Asia, and then much of Southeast Asia do not have existing AI national strategies or have expressed, as far as we can tell, no direct interest in them. This is of grave concern because in the realm of cybersecurity and in other realms such as cyber surveillance and influence factors, there are countries which will come in and say, hey, you don't have an AI national strategy, let us help you develop one. And oh, by the way, we'll invest, say, $100 million in a new institute such as China has done in several countries. And once that institute is then in place, data then will go back to the root countries such as China, and you can somewhat lose influence in the country. So from the cybersecurity realm, this is of a grave concern. And so I was quite intrigued by the request by ISPI and Brookings to look into what the national strategies have in terms of relevancy for cybersecurity. So in the parlance of the intelligence community in which I came from just 3 years ago, the bottom line up front from the section on cybersecurity and AI national strategies. First off, about 6 years ago, I forecasted with my colleagues in the US government that it would be soon, and we did not define what soon is, a realm of AI versus AI in the realm of cybersecurity. That is to say, AI will be both offensive and defensive. And the context is, right now we're seeing this. So the capabilities of artificial intelligence, as has so well been clarified by prior panelists, have augmented dramatically in the last few years. Since 2012, the ability to do facial recognition, to do algorithm development, to do a whole wide range of things that cover the entire swath of the economic spectrum are now so pronounced that it's getting to the point in cybersecurity where if you don't have an AI embedded in your system in some ways, and I work with startups directly myself, many of the venture capital firms won't really take you seriously because they're saying, well, the human being himself or herself cannot act fast enough to counter an AI attack or and be an AI defender. We did look very deeply into the question of what cybersecurity aspects are there within the AI national strategies. Having read all the AI national strategies back in July of 2019, and believe me, they are quite fascinating, and I would encourage folks to, if you have a chance, download the report from July 2019, which is still on our website, which you can, I'll show at the very end. They range anywhere from 4 pages out to over 300 pages. And so it's fascinating because I kind of suspected, but in the research that Brookings and ISPI were working with me in, it is actually not a major consideration in most of the reviewed AI national strategies. That could be because many of the AI national strategies were written in the past, back in early 2017 and so forth. The exception is the United States, in which its AI national strategy does address the need for metrics, as they say, to make safe and secure the creation, evaluation, and deployment and containment of AI. So the United States has a more recent AI national strategy. Countries which are developing them right now, I actually think have a bit of advantage on countries which have already locked in AI national strategies. And I encourage countries, and we work with governments right now and be happy to work with ISPI and Brookings in the same realm, to update their AI national strategies to consider more cybersecurity. The one aspect that I do know of, though, is that cybersecurity is addressed directly in several separate cybersecurity national plans. So these national plans do go into great depth on what cybersecurity should be encountered, whether it should be offensive or defensive in its various capacities within the various countries. And so they have that. So nevertheless, from the overarching perspective, amongst the 6 or 7 strategies that we reviewed for just this book contribution, there was actually very little mention of cybersecurity. And I won't go into details because of the very little mention, but you can just skim through the book chapter contribution that we have that I authored and take a look at them. There are risks, however, that exist, that each state is pursuing its own agenda regarding AI. As I mentioned in that global graphic, the countries which are not engaged are very, shall we say, susceptible to influence from other countries. Hopefully that influence would come from Western nations such as the United States and European countries, but unfortunately much of it is coming from China. So China, being a autocratic country, is imposing its own will on a lot of these countries. The United States has its own perspectives on AI. European policies do as well. There is risk that is very much a splintering or fragmenting, as so well elucidated by other panelists, of what's going on in artificial intelligence. One of the things that I was talking with my United Nations colleague about is how do we engage more with these countries so that we have more partnerships, we have more things that such great folks such as Darryl were clarifying earlier, that we reach out and do some things so that we don't get into situations where it is even more AI versus AI. So I state in conclusion on this part of the slide that future work could assess select state cybersecurity national strategies. I would encourage ISPI and Brookings, if they're looking into a next level, this could be one aspect of that level for possibly a future book contribution. I want to close with just, especially being here in the United States, we have intense interest in the Biden-Harris administration, and this is something I'm working on very closely, and it is very cybersecurity related, so I thought I would just put in this very last slide. There is a major new focus on science and technology. You may, if you watch the Joe Biden and Kamala Harris speak in their acceptance speeches just recently, they mentioned science and technology several times within their talks, which for all those of us in the science and technology community was quite fascinating and quite exciting. There are major issues which are on their transition website, such as pandemic response, climate change, economy, and several others that are in the wings that they're working on very aggressively, in which S&T will play key roles. There could and very well will be major policy shifts, especially relevant to cybersecurity. I show those in the purple. I list all the ones that I've called from many think tanks, including the great work from Brookings, in terms of what's going to happen in the coming weeks, months, when the new Biden-Harris administration is in place. Everything from various appointments, antitrust enforcements, competitiveness policies, use and limits to face rec and surveillance, the various funding things that are going to be put in place. There is talk, for example, just one random topic, clean energy. There's talk right now in the United States of, and if it gets past Congress, of course, of investing something like $2 trillion in clean energy within the United States, which would be a game changer in the space. And that would have direct cybersecurity implications as well. Internet privacy, the Section 230 reforms, which is a very obscure clause within a bill which would adjudicate legal responsibilities for social media pubs. And then what I conclude in what's called the all science race. So in the past, like for instance, when I used to work in the US government, there was discussion of, oh, well, we have an AI race, or we have a cybersecurity race, or there's a hypersonics race. Well, now, especially within the last few weeks in which China came out with its next 5-year plan, they are talking about an all science race. So that is to say, China especially wants to dominate in every single sector. And so if Western nations want to be true players, remain true players in science and technology, they cannot look at things in a siloed realm anymore. They must look at the holistic, in the great words, the panoptic perspective of this area for increased R&D funding, aggressive in the context, pro-US policies, bias obviously toward us in the United States, et cetera. I do have a caveat at the very end. Much of this will be dictated by who dominates in the Senate. So we are kind of interesting in the United States in a 3-branch government, the Congress and the POTUS, the President of the United States, are oftentimes at odds, and they have been, especially during the whole Obama administration, in which the Senate was not controlled by Democrats. There is a chance, however, that the Senate might be split 50-50. It will very much depend upon the January 5th vote in the state of Georgia, whether that goes toward a tying vote. Vice President-elect Harris in the chamber would hold if it went to a 50-50 split. So my contact information is right there. I'm happy to reach out to anybody, and particularly interested in working with governments and other think tanks to essentially advance the knowledge of where we are in this space, because it is super crucial that we do not ignore what's going on in other countries. We look holistically from a geopolitical perspective, from a wide variety of perspectives, so that we can move forward in the, as so well clarified, ethical spaces of artificial intelligence to make it generally a better world. So I'll turn it on back to Caitlin, and happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Thomas. Now we have about a few more minutes left to answer audience questions. I encourage anybody watching to submit your questions over Zoom, Facebook, or YouTube. First, though, I would love to start by asking Thomas a question. So I was fascinated by the number of countries, either with AI national strategies or countries which have expressed interest in them. So I was wondering, how should countries proceed from here? Are there opportunities for collaborations between nations, or are there cases, especially related to national security, where it might be more beneficial for a country to work alone on developing an agenda?
Well, certainly, thank you, Caitlin, for that great question. Certainly, there are opportunities for collaboration. One of the interesting things, and that's one of the points why I made that final slide about the Biden-Harris administration, is collaboration stemming out of the United States will very much depend upon the politics, unfortunately. So in the past 4 years, we have been, shall we say, less collaborative than we have been in the prior 8 years of the Obama administration. I'll just leave it at there. But so there is tremendous potential, certainly from a national security perspective. Countries will do what countries have in their best interests. From overarching perspectives, such as areas such as the economy or cybersecurity, or realms in which it would benefit countries to collaborate, I strongly encourage that. I was, for example, in a meeting in a China-US-EU meeting in Paris last year, and I spoke and I said, you know, we have all these AI national strategies. They are many of them are more collaborative than others, and it is fascinating just from a cultural perspective to read them all to see who is focused upon. But there is great potential, and moreover, these AI national strategies, many of them were written, as I said, a few years ago, and so they need to be updated. So there is an opportune time we're in right now in which countries, especially with the new Biden-Harris administration, could revamp their AI national strategies toward a more collaborative posture. And I would encourage that overall. Technology does not live in a silo. Technology does not live in a single country. We need to work together as a globe, especially talking to my colleagues, the United Nations, the Sustainable Development Goals will not be achieved, for example, without collaboration.
Great, thanks so much. And next I have a question for Samuele. You talk about how authoritarian governments can use technology, and specifically AI, to enhance their surveillance programs. And so my question is about the geopolitical considerations of surveillance. How has the international community addressed surveillance, and are there any tensions between advancing AI and other technologies while also establishing safeguards to protect against any potential harms or abuses?
Thank you very much, Catherine, for the questions. Well, so far, the international cooperation around these issues has been very, very low and very limited and fragmented. When I was researching for for the analysis, for the chapter, I mean, I was not eventually so much surprised by this, because somehow this competition over informational communication technologies has been drifting apart since the mid-90s, when the regulation of the information technology, in particular in cyberspace, has emerged as an international issue at the United Nations. And since then, I'm afraid to say that what we have witnessed, it's basically an increasing fragmentation among the international community. There are basically two main approaches that are confronting among several issues which include surveillance, which include especially data and how we can manage data. There are those who advocate for basically the principle of freedom of any kind of content or any kind of censorship on content and those on data, whereas there are others that consider cyberspace and informational technologies as another medium, like the press. And so they ask for regulation even for what concerns their content. And so these approaches have been somehow confronting around several resolutions at the United Nations. And during my research, I was in particular looking at the resolution that were establishing the United Nations group of governmental experts, which is a forum where there are experts that are trying to setting the rules of responsible cyberspace behavior for states. And it was quite interesting to find how a sort of correlation between those countries that use artificial intelligence for surveillance programs and the refusal to vote for the establishment of these fora. And this fora, just to be more informative, was lately has been backed by the United States, whereas the Russian were baking another kind of resolution, which was which has another name, which is the Open-Ended Working Group on similar topics. So there is a general tendency of fragmentation, and maybe I'm pessimist, maybe I come from a realist approach for what concerns cyberspace, but I'm very, very concerned that as long as we don't resolve first issues around the general governance about cyberspace and then data, it will be very much difficult to then have an agreement also on artificial intelligence and its purposes. But I hope to be wrong. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So we're running low on time, so I'm just going to take one question from the audience. I'll give the final word to Thomas and then to Samuele. The question is, how has the COVID-19 pandemic impacted the areas of research laid out in your papers, if at all?
So I'll go first, Samuel, if that's okay. So real quick, the interesting thing, as I mentioned earlier, there has been a bit of a stagnation in terms of government activities, and myself, and I know Brookings has written about this as well, the aspect of digital diplomacy, this world in which we now live, of virtual worlds everywhere, has stagnated a lot of the diplomatic activities around the world. The United Nations General Assembly, for example, was held all virtually for the first time ever. Very much, unfortunately, it was their 75th anniversary. And I know they'd been planning for it for a long time to have a big celebration, but they had to hold it virtually. So there has been a stagnation amongst government activities for artificial intelligence in general. I mean, certainly there are some countries which are still remaining very, very active, but it is sad. And so I hope that the aspects of digital diplomacy in the barriers that we have in this, so we say, two-dimensional world can be overcome, because there is a fear of myself and my colleagues that these sorts of things, the treaties, the collaborations, the cooperations that need to be done, that was so well clarified by all the panelists, is being postponed overall. And so the pandemic as a secondary effect is compromising treaty negotiations, engagements amongst the highest senior policymaker levels. People are going in having pre-prepared recorded speeches in which they're not having the water cooler conversations afterward, shall we say, and that has postponed all the discussions. So overall, the pandemic has been very bad in that context. And in addition, of course, all the horrible deaths and case counts and everything else. So it has been difficult for, I know, think tanks and advisory groups such as myself and Brookings and others, and then overall amongst the senior policymakers.
Thank you for the questions, very punctual. Well, yes, COVID-19, the pandemic, the outbreak of the pandemic has had, of course, some implication even for what concerns surveillance practices or surveillance mispractices. And I'm conducting another study for another outlet, which will be published up soon. And here I'm investigating a bit what's the impact of policies against misinformation, disinformation after the outbreak of the pandemic in non-democratic regime. And here I can say that so far the results have been quite controversial. On one side, there are like very authoritarian regimes that they really didn't take advantage of the outbreak of the pandemic to conduct or to increase or to harshen surveillance practices. Whereas what it's maybe even more concerning is the fact that in democracy with objectives, in this case, we saw governments passing policies to enhance their surveillance powers and surveillance policies because of the outbreak of COVID-19. And unless these remain some sort of temporal or under, in any case, a sort of rule of law approach and rule of law understanding, this might get this might have an effect on the overall regime's development. This is still, I repeat, something I'm still investigating right now. I will hopefully publish the future work where I will provide a better picture on the effects of COVID on surveillance practices. But the question was extremely punctual. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. So I believe we're at the end of our time. Thank you again to ISPI, our hosts, and to my fellow panelists and co-authors. And finally, thank you to our audience for joining us today. Unfortunately, we weren't able to get to all of your questions, but I encourage everybody to read our new report, which is now available on the ISPI website, because we cover many more topics and considerations related to artificial intelligence and the important policy implications that this technology will have. So back to Fabio.
Well, thank you, Kathleen. Just to thank all the, of course, General Allen and Ambassador Massolo and all the participants to this event. Thank you so much. Let's hope for a fourth annual conference of the ISPI Center on Cybersecurity live in person. Thank you so much. And without much further ado, have a great evening. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.